Hello everyone and welcome back to PASSTHEauxCORD, and welcome to the last year ever. Yeah, this is my first video of 2025, and I think it is quite symbolic of the year that we're having, that as I started recording it, my cat hopped up onto the computer and turned it off, completely killing the audio recording, so we're here trying it again. But this is the first time around I'm going to be doing this, rather than the new music podcast that we were doing before. Just going to be going through at the end of the month, talking about the new releases for each month, actually going through and just talking about each album here. This is all very new, just experimenting with things here, so this format might switch up in the future. Let me know in the comments down below if there's something you think would be a little bit better. What we're gonna do for now is start off with the most mainstream and popular releases, then go on to some slightly more niche, underground type stuff, rank them worst to best, and that's how we'll conclude the video. The first one I want to bring up here is The Weeknd with his 6th and final album, Hurry Up Tomorrow. Now this album is actually the reason that this is coming out a little deep into February here, because this dropped like right as the month was ending, unfortunately, but I did feel like I had to put it in here. This is definitely one of the most significant releases we are going to have all year. It is a truly fitting grand finale to a generational, legendary, and probably forever remembered and respected discography. The Weeknd is one of the greatest and most popular pop stars of my generation, and growing up with his music pretty much being inescapable just feels right that, you know, we're closing things off here. It's the 3rd entry of 3 different trilogies. There's kind of a mirroring thing going on that's unfortunately ruined by the change of cover art here. But other than that, it's just such a good way to close things off. This 4-track run at the end here just feels like a nice little final chapter and epilogue. But beyond the actual just like symbolic meaning behind all of it and where it sits inside of his discography, this also just has so many bangers on it. There are hit songs front to back across this thing. I think personally Cry For Me is going to be the new Blinding Lights. You got some pretty crazy features on here even. Enjoy the Show with Future is probably also going to be a pretty big hit if we're gonna pick any out of this pretty long runtime. Even looking at tracks like Niagara Falls, Take Me Back to LA, just so much of this album works so well, and I can't wait for these songs to be inescapable all year, and I think the year will be better for it. So yeah, greatest final chapter we've seen in a while here. I feel like this retirement is one we can actually count on. I don't think we're gonna have a Logic moment here, because the other thing this does is loops perfectly back around to the first track on House of Balloons. Yeah, so we have a closed loop of a trilogy of trilogies here. It's such a cool moment. I am so glad this turned out how it did. It's arguable that the album's a little bloated. It's arguable that some songs don't hit quite as hard as others, but overall, playing it front to back numerous times already since it came out has been a very enjoyable experience for me. And the next of the mainstream releases I want to talk about here is Mac Miller's Balloonerism, an album that was supposedly at least mostly finished or entirely finished, depending on your source, back while Mac was still with us here in the world. This is a posthumous release, and a lot of it, I believe, got leaked or just ended up out there in the world back in 2020, and fans have been waiting for a official release of this album, and it's here, and it's amazing. His estate's really just been sitting around with his greatest work just on the hard drive for God knows how long now. I believe this was recorded around the time of Faces, and you can hear that a little bit, but the sound of it actually feels more like a transition point from that sort of underground but yet poppy sound that he was pulling from in that era, moving on to his more mellow, particularly poppy and pretty sad type sound that he did later in his career with albums like Swimming and of course Circles, the previous posthumous release. It's got some really trippy, strange experimentation, but at the end of the day, even beyond the great production, the personality at the core here is really what sells it. There's so much charisma here, there are great lines all over it, there's moments that feel a little bit funny, but there's stuff that, you know, you can quote and just respect that line forever. All sorts of things all over here. This is a beautiful piece of work, and I think it's a very cohesive, consistent album as well. Honestly, if we aren't to consider by the time I get to Phoenix by Injury Reserve a posthumous album, this is now my favorite posthumous album. I could go on about it for a long time and break it down a little bit more thoroughly, but honestly, it's one that would need a video of its own. Next, we'll go ahead and hop over to Eusexua by FKA Twigs. I believe her third official album, because I think we had a mixtape back in 2022. And this one's really neat. It's kind of having a Brat moment, I would say, if we wanted to compare it to an album from last year, but these aren't necessarily extremely comparable albums or anything. It's just that this is a bigger artist doing something pretty experimental, kind of cutting edge, but also reviving certain sounds. There's a lot that's digging into more underground styles of electronic music and putting it out for the masses, for a lot of people to see, and therefore you have a lot of people not normally exposed to these sounds experiencing it, having fun with it, and this is a very fun to listen to album. The range that it covers is especially great, especially really cool to see, because you have songs here that you could definitely play at a party, put it on in any setting, nobody's going to bat an eye at it being too weird or anything. Perfect Stranger, Girl Feels Good, the title track to an extent, maybe even Childlike Things with Northwest, which is maybe the craziest feature I've seen this month. But then you have tracks like Drums of Death featuring Corliss, who also did a lot of the production work on this album. And that's some straight up headphone music. Like, don't try to play that outside. Everybody would think it's weird, you know? And as not great of a comparison as it might admittedly be, if we were going to compare it again to Brat, there's an emotional, deeper layer to this that you do see on certain songs. And I think when you dig into it and give the lyrics a little bit more of time of day, you'll see a little bit more in this album, and I think that's cool too. So it's got a wide array of sounds, it's exposing people to new things potentially, it's got a lot going for it. I don't think that it's the most consistent album by any means, and there's some songs that I don't really plan to come back to, but the great ones are really great. And then we're gonna go into this next one by Bad Bunny here, the latest release from him, naturally going to be shaking the world a little bit, especially in the Latin music side of things with a new Bad Bunny release. And I think that this is probably the best one, at least that I've heard from him. I think that it's easily a step in the right direction. There are so many fun tracks on here, lots of replay value on this record. Just like a lot of these more mainline big album releases for the year, this is another one that's quite long. We're clocking in at 67 minutes here, but I'm shocked at how consistently enjoyable this is. There's not any songs I dislike. Bad Bunny proves to be a great vocalist on this, and the features on it actually match him quite well, and I thought that there was a lot of great energy, great charisma throughout it. Even as a lyricist, and even though that sort of comes second in this blend of pop music that you would typically be getting, really good stuff there too as well. I don't speak Spanish, so I'm going to be a little bit lacking in understanding potentially, but what's here is good. What's here is good for sure. Very consistent album, and even if you're not into Bad Bunny or the genre as a whole, I would absolutely recommend giving this one a listen. It's a blast to listen to. It's so much fun. Unlike the Bad Bunny album, one that you can't necessarily describe as fun but is still quite good is going to be Perverts by Ethel Cain. So we got Ethel Cain coming back at us here. She is a little bit more underground than the previous ones I mentioned, but I feel like she's reached enough status, especially on the online space, to kind of put her new record here up in this space. One of the more popular releases of the year for sure, and this is a dark, brooding, ominous, downright terrifying at times, but sometimes even peaceful and relaxing EP that is an hour and a half long. I am by no means an Ethel Cain expert. In fact, I don't think I've ever listened to an album front to back, but I know that drone and dark ambient aren't exactly where she usually is making music, so this is a total different switch up if you've been into her music in the past, and I'm not sure how it's going to stack up for fans. I think a lot of people were appreciating this one though, and I can say that I definitely did. This is an experience to listen to. What I also really loved is that there's not necessarily only tracks here that dive into a dark ambient direction. There's some stuff that feels pretty regularly like a song, even if it's a little bit more experimental, a little bit more off the beaten path. Punish, I want to say, is probably the most popular song from the record so far, and it's easy to hear why if you listen to it. There's very little more you can really say about an hour-and-a-half long EP of a genre that an artist doesn't even go into without really diving into the weeds of it here, so we'll keep it simple. And I do want to point out that Ethel Cain herself said that the album feels erotic to her in a post, which, listening to it, is a little bit weird to imagine how that could possibly work at most points. Moving on. Next up here, we got one that I forgot even released until looking back at the releases for the month. That is Lil Baby with WHAM, which I believe is an acronym for Who Hard As Me, if I'm correct, which is a choice for sure. This one's just boring. It's bland. It's a Lil Baby album. It might be one of the better Lil Baby albums that I've heard, but not by a lot. It's not making me a fan. It's not doing a lot to impress me. The production on here is usually fine, but fine is as far as it ever goes. In fact, what would have been one of the better songs is ruined by its production, that being Outfit with 21 Savage. The beat on there is extremely annoying, really taking away from any replay value it had for me. And the features here in general are usually pretty good, but they do end up kind of taking away from it, because if you look at the second track on here, Dumb Dumb and Dumber with Future and Young Thug, it shows just how much Lil Baby is a imitation of them, more or less, and just kind of makes me wish I was listening to either one of them instead. I mean, Future just dropped like 3 albums last year. Just go listen to Future at this point. And something that's kind of in the same vein but across the pond is Central C with Can't Rush Greatness. Apparently you can't rush mediocrity either when it comes to Central C, because this is a pretty boring, bland, inconsistent, and not that fun to listen to release, all things considered. It is exactly the same sort of UK drill that we've been seeing coming out of the UK and having crossover appeal over here in the States pretty greatly, but not really doing anything to change it up. The production across it is totally fine, much in the same way that the Lil Baby album was, but these beats are just not anything to write home about at all. It really kind of just sounds like they're the stock footage of beats, you know? Like, this is what happens when you type in blank type beat on YouTube, you know? It's just really regular average stuff. And Central C's rapping is so samey throughout every track. He really has like 2 flows, you know? I mean, there's not any variation, any versatility here, but for the most part, if you pick any individual track off of it and listen to it, it's not going to be a painful listen. Like, it's fine. It's totally fine. I guess throw it on if you really want to, if you're into this type of music. I think the only egregiously bad song on it is Gen Z Love, which, like, what was the concept for this song? No reason to make this. No reason to make this at all. It's quite bad. And then quickly, I want to actually tap into one from December, that being Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre's Missionary. This album has been teased for so long. I want to say we're going on like 5 years or something that this has just been rumored to exist, and now it does, and now the album covers a condom, and why is that a thing? Who knows? For the most part, this listen is fine, but I found it to be a real chore to get through most of the time when listening to it. It's incredibly inconsistent, with it going in many different sounds, styles, etc. I mean, you've got a Jelly Roll feature on one track. It's obviously not all going to be tapping into exactly that gangster rap OG 90s type of Snoop Dogg style, and I don't think any of us expected that. I don't think any of us expected this to even be like 90s and 2000s level Dr. Dre, really, but I have to wonder what Dr. Dre even really did for the album as a whole, because you have so many producers on this, you have so many writers on this, and it doesn't really sound like Snoop or Dre really locked in at any point and gave the wholehearted effort. I had to go check and was shocked to just see that this was 46 minutes, because even though we are talking about some albums crossing well over the hour mark, and already have in this episode, I think that this was the longest feeling album. Like, this is so much to sit and listen through for some reason. It's only 16 tracks, and I believe there was an interlude somewhere in there. I guess not necessarily an interlude, but there's a couple of very short tracks. And yet it feels like I sit down and listen to this thing for so long without getting anything from it. And there's not really memorable tracks on it. I'm having a lot of issue recalling very many details about this album at all, and it was less than a month ago, I think, since the last time I heard it, which just isn't really what anybody in the hip-hop fan base, the very dedicated fan base for this sort of thing, was really hoping for, because this was teased for so long. It's a duo that, at least in most respects, is considered pretty legendary, and you would think that it's just going to be something a lot better than this, but instead it came out feeling like a very commercialized, very basic sounding project that kind of feels more like a cash grab than a passion project. And we're going to take a brief break from the video to talk about our sponsor today. VPN. Just VPN. None of them are paying me. You need one. Go get a VPN. That's all. Don't get a free one. Bad for your security. It's kind of the opposite of what you want. They're cheap. They're real cheap. Go pay for one. You need it. Now, more or less, we've covered the mainstream releases of the month, so we're gonna go worst to best on everything else I heard, starting off with Jades, otherwise known as Nunya, apparently, using the old creepypasta slash thing that the YouTube algorithm probably doesn't want me to say, image thing as the album cover, not really structuring this like an album or EP anywhere, just kind of throwing these songs up onto SoundCloud. Jade's got my worst album of last year place, handedly, easily. Like, I gave more than 1-0 last year, but that one was like a negative 10 out of 10, okay? And we are seeing the same thing on Nunya's whatever here. Terrible, terrible, terrible pop punk music made by a SoundCloud kind of, I guess, rapper. I don't know if we're still using the term SoundCloud rapper, but that's how Jade's got his start, and he's now on the run, apparently, based on what I can tell, and just managed to release this. And it's like, dude, you are probably risking a lot in that situation to drop music. Why would you risk anything to release this? Like, fucking terrible. Straight up, like, zero. This is an EP, so thankfully not very long. It is some of the most painful pop punk music you can really expect to ever hear, and we definitively have the worst EP of the year here. I'm almost certain of that case. Something could happen, you know, I mean, it's 2025, all bets are off. He could drop again, honestly. So maybe it won't. Maybe the next one will be worse, but it's very hard to say. But I would predict this has to be the worst EP of the year. And as we move on to this new EP by Busta Rhymes, it's pretty impressive that Jades does have the definitive spot, because this is one of the worst EPs I've heard in a long minute as well. I'm realizing at this point, with how well established and long running Busta Rhymes' career has been, maybe I should have put this in the more mainstream releases, but it's certainly not getting attention like a mainstream release would, and discussion around it, because I'm pretty sure most people just heard like the first 5 seconds of this and turned it off immediately. Technically, this EP is ruined by its production, but it's ruined even more so by the fact that Busta Rhymes just does not seem to know how to handle this bad production at all. Still doing that like chain smoker in his 80s type inflection, going hard, really just rapping and rapping over these terrible fucking beats, but he says some absolutely downright ridiculous bars on here, and he's not on beat almost ever. Like, it's just the beats over here, he's up here, nowhere are they intersecting whatsoever on most tracks, and most of these beats are some of the most ridiculous I've heard. Seriously, like, laughable stuff on here. I would absolutely recommend listening to this, despite it being one of the lowest scores I'll probably give all year, because for the 18 minutes it was on, I was genuinely laughing out loud. You know, I mean, I don't think we have any problems giving Busta Rhymes streams necessarily. I think that's fine. Go stream this. Go stream this. It's hilarious. It's hilarious. I recommend it. It is awful. And we are going to start going through these a little bit quicker here as I get into the third worst release, I guess. This is Ethel Cain's Nobody Is Coming to Save You, really tapping into that 2018 SoundCloud market with the cover art here, and it is giving just about as much effort as a lot of the music coming out around that time is. This is diving pretty hard into kind of the rage trends and aesthetics, and not doing anything to improve it outside of that. Ethel Cain is proving to be extremely lacking in versatility on this project and says some puzzlingly dumb lyrics all over it. Production's not very good. There's nothing unique about this, and there's not really any redeeming qualities in the rapping either. What we're gonna go to up next here is Boldy James and Rich Gaines on production for Murder During Drug Traffic. This one ends up so low and so lowly rated by me, just strictly for the fact that the production on here is very boring, pretty terrible all around. Like, this is the type of album that ruins my day to listen to, because I just can't really find anything to appreciate about it during its entire runtime for the most part. And much of that comes down to it just being very boring, very dull. I believe my written review here said Griselda flavored melatonin. That's really kind of what we're working with. By no means is Boldy James rapping terribly on here, but he is really having his flaws shown more clearly than normal by the fact that the production he's behind just isn't really doing anything, so it makes him come across a lot less versatile, a lot less charismatic as well than he normally would. And all around, if there was one I was going to recommend the least to listen to, probably this one. Like, you're just not missing anything by not listening to this one at all. That's not to say anything really bad about Boldy James either, because I did like his project from last year, one of his projects that came out pretty recently, quite a bit, and I think he's still a good rapper. I just think that this is maybe the least fitting environment for him. Not necessarily fitting, I guess, in aesthetics, but just not flattering. Next up here, we are going to do Paleface Swiss, which is a band I hadn't heard of before, but they've got a new record out here. They appear to be a pretty mainstream metal act at this point. They're doing a deathcore thing that's mixed with nu metal. A lot of the time there's some rapping on this project that comes across pretty terribly, but as far as any of the core type genres with metal, what you have throughout most of this is very formulaic, even if kind of meeting the standards, but it's this very try-hard, edgy type of mood that it gives off constantly that even ruins the more normal sounding sections that could go kind of hard. Overall, there's redeeming qualities in the musicianship for sure, but there's a lot of cringe on here that just doesn't make it worth listening to. Another band sort of in the metal genre, but more rock, I guess. We got Tremonti, The End Will Show Us How, which does not really look like that's what the cover says, because it's going the wrong direction. I don't know what's up with that. I had to look up if this is an Avenged Sevenfold side project, or like at least a M Shadow side project, because the sound of it is so derivative in a lot of ways of the general mainstream rock and metal stuff, and the vocals are practically identical. So there's that. This is an hour long, and while I guess some of the hooks are kind of fun, there's some riffs that end up going kind of hard. It's not worth it at all. Next up here, we've got another metal record, that being Gravedigger Bone Collector. So many, like, it's like a word salad of metal words all together, and that is a perfect representation of how this album sounds. The cover is apparently AI generated, that you can see behind me right now, and that's just so fitting. This is such AI generated metal. This is so generic, so incredibly exactly what you think it is. So that's not to say that it's incredibly terrible, because there is value in the tropes of metal as a whole, but you won't find most of it here because there's not any creativity to exactly push those great elements forward. Next up here, gonna go with Osama Sun, and Osama Sun just appears to be another person hopping on the rage wave of things. I noted this in my written review as well, but it's kind of crazy how many people have managed to make a career based off of the fact that Playboi Carti never drops music, because the fans of that sort of music that he kind of sort of paved the way with Whole Lotta Red are naturally going to be itching for more music like it, that and Die Lit, really. So you have a bunch of people who've just built careers on essentially imitating that, and Osama Sun isn't really proving to be much else other than that to me. Really, the only thing that's setting him apart as a rapper is some painfully dumb lyrics, but you're not really coming to rage for lyrics anyways, so that is what it is. And a slightly annoying vocal inflection, I would describe it as. It's just not really coming off with much charisma, kind of a grating tone, all things considered. Just don't love it. I saw a lot of people complaining about the production. I'm kind of wondering if that's a cope of some sort, because I didn't really see anything wrong there, strangely. Next up, we're going to take a look at the new Franz Ferdinand album here. I remember getting suggested to listen to Franz Ferdinand a decent bit back when I was doing more reaction videos, and this channel was essentially a Strokes and Arctic Monkeys fan page just due to what people wanted me to make. It's not surprising to me that this is kind of right in that vein, but really it's so far in that vein that I don't get any distinct personality, any real definitive noteworthy qualities from this that I don't feel like I could get elsewhere. For what it's worth, I hear this and I can tell that it would definitely be fun to hear played live. You got a lot of fun hooks, got a lot of nice little grooves on here for sure. It's just lacking in definitive standout qualities. What's here as far as that goes, I honestly end up finding a little bit annoying. There's certain sections on here that end up being a little bit grating to me, and I'm not sure if anybody else is picking up on that, so I won't go too far into it. But overall, I just don't really have a great reason to listen to this, despite it being pretty okay music. Pretty much the same feeling as I get from the Libertines, honestly. Next up here, we got Lambrini Girls, Who Let the Dogs Out. This is a post-punk release, a little bit of that sort of thing going on here. I want to say it's an all-girl band, given the name, so kind of doing that whole subversive thing. And it's cool to see. I like the politics of this record, just kind of the statements that they're trying to make, but it is a little bit straightforward to the point of maybe coming across preachy in that regard. I don't think that there's a lot of nuance or commentary, and that kind of does feel like it's the main central focus of the record, but nonetheless, I fuck with the vision, even if the vision could have been executed a little bit better. I think that the instrumentals on here are fine. If you're really into Idols, you'll probably find a decent bit to like there. I am a fan of Idols. It kind of feels like that post-punk that's gone like semi-mainstream, that type of sound. Realistically, the main thing holding this back for me, because I could look past everything I just said, if the vocals don't sound quite like they did, because there's a pretty annoying vocal tone that honestly I'm just not into whatsoever. But if you're into this specific post-punk type of delivery where it's very shouty, this is sometimes doing a little bit of like a faster shouty thing at times too, so it is not for me. Like, really, this album isn't bad, it's more just not for me. I don't have much else to say about it. Moving right along. Here we have Jasmine 4T, You Are the Morning, a singer-songwriter record, despite the very hyperpop looking cover. and it is produced by the members of Boy Genius, so that was very interesting. I saw that production credit and I was like, why are they working on a hyperpop album? And then it all made sense as soon as I started listening to this album. Lots of great lyricism on this record. The blend of singer-songwriter that is being pulled off by Boy Genius, and of course Jasmine Forti's instrumentation as well, is solid. It's fine. I'm not really ever particularly blown away by it, but it's fine. Eventually, this ends up actually sounding a lot like the last album that I said before. I'm just not into the vocals. The vocals aren't for me. When you're in such a stripped back and intimate type of sound, that's most of what you're going to be focusing on. That's front and center. You know, there's a lot of emotion. Again, there's some great writing. I just don't like how it's portrayed necessarily in the vocals. And that's not even really a big actual criticism or something that someone would have to fix. It's just, I'm not into it. Next up here is Lil Shine. Shine Forever. Cloud rap is having a generational run lately. It is great. It is awesome. We're getting a new Young Lean album. I want to see a new Black Cray album. That would be super cool. Blade coming through again would also be cool. That's all yet to be seen. But the way the cloud rap year started off, January 1st, literally first day of the year, is Lil Shine with Shine Forever. And now this is an album that a lot of people are going to enjoy a little bit more than me, especially if you're a fan specifically of Lil Shine. I personally am a little bit mixed, a little bit indifferent when he gets into a really catchy bag and makes some things more anthemic, a little bit bolder, a little bit off of this sound that he particularly curated, sets itself apart from the other songs on an album. I end up really liking those songs. And there's a few on here. Kiss Me Through the Phone, God, and Worst Me ended up being my favorites, and I have came back to those songs a little bit. They are totally playlist-ready bangers. I do think, though, if you're gonna run this album front to back, you're gonna get a lot of samey stuff, and even though it's a short listen, this abrasive, very bright and explosive sound that Lil Shine works with is kind of fatiguing when every song is more or less the same. Next up here we got Ringo Starr, Look Up. Kind of funny that the first Beatles solo album I'm actually listening to ever is Ringo Starr going country about 60 years deep in his career, but I did, and it's pleasant. It's a nice country album. Every song is the same on it. Once you've heard the first one, you've heard every song. I guess that's not entirely true, because Molly Tuttle is featured on multiple tracks, and so is Billy Strings, who is featured on the first track. So actually it appears you need to get 2 songs in order to hear everything, and then the rest is just the same. But it's very pleasant. It's nice on the ears. It's better than a lot of the country getting put out, I guess, because, I mean, there's some heart in it. It's kind of cute. It's kind of nice. It's Ringo Starr making country music for reasons, but I don't hate it. I don't hate it, really. Next up here, we have an EP by Logic, Aquarius 3. This is leftovers, from what I understand, of his really great Ultra 85 project that came out last year. We're still doing the sci-fi stuff with this. We're still having that futuristic cinematic presentation. I don't think that these are some of the better songs I've heard from this era of Logic at all, though, unfortunately. There's a little bit of a lack in hooks here. It's kind of just straightforward rapping for the sake of rapping, just kind of going in. Beats are pretty nice. There's a very sentimental little outro clip there that seems to be a old voice recording of him. That's sweet, I guess. I don't really need to listen to it every time I listen to the project, but the other 3 songs here are fine. It's Logic's music being Logic's music, and at the end of the day, it's a lot better than a lot of the stuff that he's put out before. Next up here we have Mirar Ascension, a French gent band, I believe, or metalcore, or however we want to look at it. A little bit more unique, a little bit more ethereal and whimsical than a lot of the gent that comes out that you end up seeing. I expected this to be a lot more generic than it was. Still goes on a little bit long. I do like some of the longer tracks and the versatility that's worked in there, but I do feel like this record could have been shortened down at least another 10 minutes really, because we do get some samey stuff, but at the end of the day, it's samey stuff that's really nice to listen to if you're into something slightly heavier. Next up, we've got former Haunted Mound member Turnabout coming through with a album called Gorgeous. I want to say his first album solo. Last year we saw a great EP from him and a pretty okay EP from him. This is heading more down the route of pretty okay. There are some of his best songs on here, some total bangers. Drop Dead, I think, is my favorite Turnabout song, at least since he's gone solo, probably in general. And that's kind of crazy, because Luck Dismain was so good. But this one's infinitely more replayable to me than that one. So, like, artistic merit versus catchy replayability, Drop Dead has it for sure. And he's not necessarily doing anything particularly driven by a certain aesthetic on Gorgeous. It's kind of playing to a lot of the Chief Keef influenced trap and drill that Haunted Mound came up on. There's not so much of the horrorcore spooky aesthetics, despite what all of the skulls and flames in the album cover might lead you to believe. There's not a whole lot of that going on, but he definitely cooked up some bangers, and it's definitely very clear Gonerville is still a great producer. Next up here, we're going to talk about Zahara. I want to say that's pronounced Spiral Your Way Out. But as far as this dreamy and more relaxed sound in indie rock goes, this is perfectly acceptable. Doesn't go a lot beyond that. It's a pretty relaxed album, a pretty soothing and calming album all around, but also has some catchy stuff in there, stuff that is a little bit more fast-paced, a little bit more to wake you up a bit, but all things considered, not going to be a super memorable release, but just one that's very musically solid if you're into indie rock that's a little bit more washed out and dreamy type stuff. Next up here, we want to talk about another post-punk project, that being Skinner New Wave Vaudeville. I guess dance punk might be a little bit more of a fitting descriptor for this record if we want to get into particulars, but it's still kind of in that general scene. I would say that if you're into Viagra Boys or similar artists like that, you will probably get a lot from this one. It's a really fun record. I like some of the lyrical concepts that are put forward here. Each song seems very isolated to itself in that there's a specific concept for each song, and I think Viagra Boys' Cave World could have even maybe been an inspiration in that way, but it's very much so reminding me of that. I don't think the sounds here are necessarily doing anything new and unique. I feel like really we've been doing sounds like this since Gang of Four, maybe even further back, you know. I mean, it's post-punk, dance punk stuff. It's fine. It's pretty cool sonically. Lots of bass, and I did appreciate that quite a bit as well. So that made it a pretty enjoyable listen all around. Next up here, we've got Super Collider and Lua Trilogy. Sunbelt Princess is the name of this one. This is a post-rock and ambient type of album, and it works in a lot of sound collage elements. I know there's a lot of clips from shows and movies in here that are incorporated very seamlessly. There's not a lot of explosivity, but it does remind me of some of the big shoegaze artists that have been coming up as of late as well, kind of in the internet scene. We'll talk about Asian Glow in a little while here, and I think you could draw some parallels there. The sampling particularly reminded me of The Books, and Thought for Food is one of my favorite albums ever, so I liked the techniques there. Otherwise, this goes on a little bit long, sometimes the run times being a significantly cut off point at like 10 minutes each, I want to say. It's really showing because it feels like things are either cut off at sort of random moments or stretched out longer than they needed to be, and it's like, I don't really know why we had to hit specifically the 10-minute mark on every track, but nonetheless, a very psychedelic, spacey, sample-heavy, instrumental rock record that I think was a pretty cool listen. Next up here we have Polish black metal band Patriarch with Prophet Ilja. Normally I'm not a black metal guy at all. I think I've made that clear at some point on the channel. If not, then I probably have on Album of the Year for sure, at least. I don't really dig a lot of black metal, but I was into this. I think the atmospheric is really emphasized in atmospheric black metal here because you have some very strong atmospheres. There's things that are worked in, even like samples to add ambiance to the mood. I believe there's some storytelling in the lyrics. They are not in my native language though, again, of course, so I'm only going to get so much of it, but there's certainly a story to be told. There's things going on in this album outside of the music alone. I think that it executed that greatly. I like the vocal tone here more than I do with a lot of black metal. I think a lot of this goes pretty hard, but it doesn't sound like a fucking sprinkler system ran through a paper shredder either. This has some very nice production, and I think maybe atmospheric black metal just might be the black metal for me, because the production value is upped significantly. Either that, or they just know what the fuck they're doing in Poland. And next up here we have Edward Skeletrix. Important that it is the Edward Skeletrix one, Museum Music. This one I rated a little bit lower than the I'm a Monster Museum Music, which we will see up a little further as well. I debated putting this in kind of our first section there where I was talking about bigger albums, because Edward Skeletrix is certainly making a wave right now, making a bit of movement in the internet rap type of space right now, and this is another reason that cloud rap is having kind of a generational run in 2025 and really making waves, doing big things. I think Edward Skeletrix is great. I think what he's doing here is extremely creative, and despite this being nowhere near my highest rated album for the month or anything, I have listened to this one the most, I think. There is infinite replay value because you might get something new out of it each time. Rap done really, really well, and it might not look like that on the surface level. I'm planning on doing Edward Skeletrix video probably next time he drops an album. Do be on the lookout. I have no idea when that'll be, but I'm going to keep it brief here because I could go on all day. Strangely, we've got a little bit of a Edward Skeletrix sandwich of black metal here, because the next one here is also black metal. We've got Harakiri for the Sky. Scorched Earth is the name of this record, and again, a black metal album in 2025 that I actually ended up enjoying. But I wouldn't put it so far as black metal. In fact, there are some other genre tags being thrown around here. This is easily the most accessible thing I've heard with black metal listed as one of the genre tags. Whether it be kind of the general instrumentation, the song structures, the vocals, or the lyrics, I think you could even draw parallels to something like earlier Bring Me the Horizon. You know, I'm talking like There Is a Hell, Believe Me, I've Seen It era, if you're into that, but if you're not, then you'll hate that comparison. I'm sure there will be more people that would hate that comparison than not, but that's to say that, you know, rather than doing super edgy tropes here, we're getting into some emotional impact stuff. The songs are very long, but they end up being pretty rewarding on here. So I did appreciate that. Lots of big, explosive, climactic moments all over this record that I think were pretty easy to appreciate. In fact, some of the shorter songs ended up not being my favorite because they didn't get quite as big of a explosive and climactic payoff. But if you're looking for a record that you can kind of listen to in the background or the foreground very easily and get a lot from it, in the metal genres as a whole, this is one to look for sure. Another metal album for the year that I enjoyed quite a bit. We're having a decent run here. We got Stick to Your Guns with Keep Planting Flowers. So this is a melodic hardcore and metalcore act that is pretty much playing to the genre's tropes, playing it pretty straightforward. So if you're into this type of genre, you kind of already know what you're getting into, especially for the more mainstream tilting stuff, the more commercial tilting stuff. But I think this goes a lot harder than the contemporaries that exist alongside it and have existed a lot throughout the past 2 decades, maybe 1 decade. That's all to say, you know, especially on kind of the emotional level, on the songwriting level, and even just some of the styles of instrumentation. I've heard a lot of stuff that's like this, but nothing quite to the level of its personality, and nothing quite to the level of how fucking hard it goes. When I reviewed this in text form on Album of the Year, I actually ended up receiving a comment correcting me because I said that this band has 2 vocalists, and I said that that's kind of par for the course for this sort of band. You know, a lot of bands have had the clean vocalist and the scream vocalist, and that's not necessarily an unheard of thing, but there's only 1 vocalist here, and his range is fucking insane. We're like in some real Chester Bennington territory where you've got like 2 guys inside of the 1 voice. Maybe that's not even the best comparison, but the range is like amazing, you know? I mean, not similar vocalists in any ways. I'm just saying that to do cleans as good as they come across here and as competent as they come across here, and then to do these kind of guttural vocals, immaculate. It's wonderful. If there was to be 1 song in particular I would recommend from the project, go listen to the title track because the emotional impact of it is kind of huge. And then if you're just looking for something that goes pretty hard, really any of the first 3 tracks are fucking awesome. I really love that this doesn't overstay its welcome too. I mean, it's a very short project and it's just giving you exactly what you need. Next up here, artist that I haven't heard of before, Ella minus Gadia, I want to say that's said, but either way, I am surprised this isn't necessarily getting more fanfare despite being a somewhat smaller artist, because this record dropped on the same day and it's actually quite similar to FKA Twigs' Eusexua, if you are to ask me. Very different vocals, a little bit of a different style of electronic music, but you can't really say that at the same time because Eusexua does so many different styles. I just immediately made the comparison, made the tie there, and maybe that's just because the albums dropped on the same day, but it does remind me of that. So if you're into Eusexua, go check this one out. Go put this on. It's got some really cool emotional edges to it, but a lot of that fun electronic dance music type appeal as well. So it's fun listen. It's great. Next up here we have 2000 Ravens. When the snow is fresh, it covers everything. Very short EP here. You're investing, I want to say, like 8 minutes of your time maybe, and we managed to span across 6 tracks, which is of course pretty par for the course for these very heavy and extreme genres of music. But what's interesting is how extreme it is almost entirely relies on the vocals, and nothing about the music, the instrumentals, and the way things are kind of parsed out and spaced out in this record are all that terribly abrasive. In fact, you get kind of like an emo or indie rock type of flair to the instrumentals here, and then the very harsh vocals that, again, kind of convey a lot of emotion as well are laid on top of it, making for a pretty interesting and standout sound. To compare to a slightly more popular band that dropped last year, Your Arms Are My Cocoon, if you're into that, you'll probably be into this, and I am definitely into that. Not to say that they're entirely similar, but you know, it's in that screamo scrams type of bag, and I don't have a lot of modern comparisons. Next up here we have an EP from Mort, self-described as a synth pop, witch house, and hypnagogic pop project. It is an instrumental EP that you definitely want to listen through because it is just super nice on the ears. If you are into those genres that I've described, there's going to be something for you because it covers them all, and I'm not really sure what else to say about it beyond that, besides it's really nice project. And popping in here, we're getting towards the top now. We've got I'm a Monster, museum music instead of the Edward Skeletrix one, this solid purple color that we're looking at here. The catchiest songs I've heard from Edward Skeletrix appear to be under this alias, and some of the best produced as well. There's some really weird sounding stuff that makes it not another Rage or Plug carbon copy. There are beats on here that really remind me particularly of Viper, even though that comparison isn't necessarily one that's as flattering as it once might have been. But what I'm saying is things get off the beaten path quite a bit, despite being pretty catchy and pretty likable in all senses of the word as well. So if you're into any kind of cloud rap, absolutely go give this a try. And I was saying if you're into any kind of cloud rap, go give the I'm a Monster album a try. You should also give this album, well, EP rather, from Bappy a try, because this is an artist I haven't heard of before. This Empty Stomach Wilting Faith project is awesome though. It comes down to being one track that is 17 minutes and 30 seconds long, but there's a lot done in that 17 minutes and 30 seconds that make it sort of multiple different songs, really. It does feel more like a traditional EP if you just listen to it with it on in the background rather than one that only has one track. It'd be kind of nice if they were actually separated so I could get a little bit more into what my favorites and least favorites were of the bunch, but overall it's doing some cloud rap stuff that's somewhat reminiscent of your Drain Gang type Swedish, cloud rap stuff, and just some general experimental things happening that don't necessarily sound like anything I've heard before, but just mark it down as another great cloud rap project that we've already seen this year. And next up here, we're getting towards the top. We're really getting there. We got Cat System Corp, the vaporwave legend, with his new record Blueberries on Mars. This isn't necessarily a vaporwave project, despite the fact that I just got done saying vaporwave legend. It is a project that is specifically space ambient. So taking a little bit of a tilt here, a little bit of a left turn, and I think it's one that worked out really nicely. This is a cool project that does exactly what it set out to do. As far as space ambient goes, if you've heard it before, it sounds like you expect it does, and if you have not heard space ambient before, it sounds like the name. So it's an album that accomplishes its goal, and it's just another great one to mark down for one of the biggest to do it in vaporwave. Alright, we're down to our last two here, and funny enough, they could both be somewhat described as cloud rap, but definitely could be described as experimental hip-hop. And the first one here we've got is Smoke Dope 2016 with The Peak. Now, I haven't really gotten around to it. If you didn't notice, I've been listening to a lot of music this month that isn't necessarily one specific artist, but I've been meaning to go back and listen to the rest of Smoke Dope 2016's music, because this being my entry point is a really impressive, super awesome entry point to actually be seeing as far as the cloud rap type tropes that we've seen throughout the years. I'm talking Black Cray, I'm talking Young Lean, etc. The production on here excellently emulates it. This has that cloud rap special sauce on tracks like In the Party. Like, if you just play that one track on its own, you'll see what I'm saying, and that doesn't really ever stop throughout the majority of it. I enjoyed some of the video game references and stuff in the lyrics. I think that Smoke Dope 2016 has a very specific lyrical style that I am into. It's not a project that overstays its welcome by any means. It is 36 minutes long and very enjoyable for that entire 36 minutes. Now, I think it gets a little samey at some points. Some tracks don't necessarily differentiate themselves from the others, but they're all so short that I guess how would you even avoid that? Really, if you're into any form of experimental hip-hop, and even if you're just a little bit more online and looking for some catchy music, you cannot go wrong here. And for our final album of January, it's Pink Sifu, Black Antique. Now, this is an experimental hip-hop record that feels sort of like just a collage of crazy, experimental, wildly different sounds, styles, and ideas. There's a different feature on almost every track. We got names like horror popping up, and I love to see that. There's some recognizable names. There's some names you probably haven't heard of. Everybody's doing really great, and there's so much going on, though, that it's kind of hard to figure out who you're even listening to at any given point. This thing is a whole 77 minutes long, and so many ideas are put out there during that 77 minutes. It makes great usage of that time because you have some insane bangers on this record, such as Sacrifice Bon Appetit is my favorite on here. That one is a hard hitter, an absolute fucking banger. But then you have, especially towards the back end of the record, much more relaxed songs, much more chilled out songs on it. And to go from 0 to 100 to 0 to 100 like that makes this one disorienting. It's really a fever dream of a record, but if you put on any specific song, it's going to be a very enjoyable experience. Whether or not it is to listen to it front to back is going to be very subjective and very up to the person kind of listening to it at any given time, because it depends on how much you want to be assaulting your own ears with. You know, there's a lot, okay? I don't think it's necessarily possible to get too deep into Pink Siifu's style of album and style of sound in a short form video like this, but absolutely go check this one out if you're into anything experimental. Okay, and unfortunately, I am a liar. There is yet another album to be speaking on for January. Just January doing its January thing, just 2025 back at us again, but Asian Glow with 11100011. Got this little binary title going on here. This is actually my top album for the month, and I'm kind of mad at myself for not realizing I hadn't talked about it yet. My favorite for the month, outside of the ones that we already talked about anyways, because that spot actually goes to Balloonerism, but this is an amazing shoegaze project. Asian Glow announced they were retiring last year just to come back at us with what might be their best project. I think it outdoes the one from last year. It outdoes anything else I've heard as well. This feels like a journey, an adventure to listen to. Front to back, it's so magical and whimsical and beautiful of a shoegaze project. It's so immersive, and the songs on here all individually have big climactic payoffs, but also sound great throughout them. It's an explosive record, and it's so fun to listen to if you're into shoegaze of any sort. It's technically more in the indie-tronica vein of things, but if you know this kind of internet-based shoegaze revivalism thing, it's very deep in that specific niche. So I'm talking bands like Julie, I'm talking Parannoul, I'm talking, of course, Asian Glow. Feels like one of the main people in this wave. And it's great to have Asian Glow back, even if the 1-year retirement does feel a little weird of a thing to do. So I can't complain, though, because this is probably going to land pretty high up even in my year-end list. This is fantastic. Alright, so that will do it for January of 2025. That is not even all of the music I listen to, though, believe it or not. You can go to my Album of the Year page and go ahead and follow me on there. If you would like some more recommendations, I usually do a pretty big write-up when I listen to something, especially if it's a little bit more underground, and there's some other great recs that you probably should go ahead and check out if you're itching for a little bit more, especially in some underground stuff. But those were the most notable releases of the month by far, just skipping over a couple of things. And I greatly appreciate you watching and staying till the end here. If you could drop a like on the video, that would be greatly appreciated as well. And you can subscribe to the channel for more music related content coming your way. Make sure to turn notifications on so you know when videos like these drop, and you can get even more recommendations and find out about the months to come. But with all that being said, that's going to wrap it up for this one, and I will see you in the next video.